October 1942. Beneath the smoldering ruins of Stalingrad lies a dark, sprawling labyrinth that no German military map ever documented. Deep inside the city's subterranean sewer system, a heavily armed German patrol wades through knee-deep, freezing water. They are hunting ghosts. For weeks, Soviet soldiers have been vanishing into thin air, only to reappear blocks behind supposedly secure German front lines, striking with devastating precision before melting back into the earth. The air down here is suffocating, thick with dust and absolute darkness. Suddenly, the German point man freezes. A faint scrape of metal against concrete echoes from a narrow drainage pipe just above them. It isn't a rat. It is a Soviet scout navigating a hidden, interconnected network of blasted-out basements, secret passages, and drainage tunnels that link the entire shattered city. Before the squad can even raise their weapons, a grenade drops from the shadows. In the blinding flash of the confined explosion, the unstoppable advance of the Third Reich is abruptly halted. This single, terrifying moment encapsulates a completely new, claustrophobic breed of combat. The German military machine, a highly sophisticated engine designed for rapid, sweeping armored dominance across open plains, had crashed headfirst into the brilliant, desperate adaptability of the Red Army. Realizing they could not outgun German mechanized formations in traditional combat, the Soviet command made a calculated, ruthless decision: drag the enemy down into the dark. They transformed pulverized apartment blocks and underground pipes into an inescapable three-dimensional fortress. The invaders gave a name to this subterranean nightmare. They called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. This is the definitive story of how the most advanced military titan of its era was systematically outplayed, stripped of its greatest tactical advantages, and dismantled in the shadows. It is a historical masterclass in survival and strategy, revealing exactly how the defenders of Stalingrad weaponized the very ashes of their city to break an empire. By late summer of 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, had reached the banks of the Volga River. To the High Command in Berlin, victory was a mathematical certainty. They wielded the most devastating military doctrine the world had ever seen, the Blitzkrieg. For 3 years, this lightning war had shattered armies across Europe through a masterclass of combined arms. The formula was brutal and incredibly efficient. First, the Luftwaffe's Stuka dive bombers would shatter enemy strongpoints. Then, massive artillery barrages would pulverize the front line. Finally, concentrated armored spearheads, the Panzer divisions, would punch through the chaos, encircling and annihilating the disoriented defenders on the open plains. When they reached the edges of Stalingrad, the Germans applied this exact same formula. On August 23rd, the Luftwaffe unleashed one of the most concentrated aerial bombardments in human history. Over 1,000 tons of explosives rained down, turning a thriving industrial metropolis into a jagged, apocalyptic landscape of shattered brick, twisted steel, and ash. The German command believed they had created a massive graveyard for the Soviet defenders. Instead, they had accidentally built them an impenetrable fortress. The commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, General Vasily Chuikov, understood a grim reality. His battered, undersupplied forces could never survive a conventional open-field battle against the highly mechanized German Titan. But in the suffocating, chaotic geography of a ruined city, the rules of war completely inverted. The apocalyptic rubble neutralized the German armor. A Panzer IV, an unstoppable terror on the open steppe, became a blind, cumbersome iron coffin in streets choked with debris. Their main guns often could not elevate high enough to target Soviet anti-tank rifles firing from third-story windows, nor could they depress low enough to hit soldiers hiding in basement craters. But Chuikov's true stroke of ruthless genius was a tactical directive that completely stripped the Germans of their greatest advantage, their air support and heavy guns. He issued a chillingly simple order: hug the enemy. Soviet commanders were instructed to keep their front lines no more than 50 yards away from the German positions, roughly the maximum throwing distance of a hand grenade. In many cases, this distance was violently reduced to the width of a single street, a narrow staircase, or even a shared wall inside a blasted apartment block. By keeping his men physically intertwined with the German infantry, Chuikov completely paralyzed the Luftwaffe. German pilots and artillerymen could no longer lay down their devastating barrages without risking the total annihilation of their own men. The pinpoint accuracy required to hit a Soviet trench without hitting a German trench just 30 yards away simply did not exist. In a matter of days, the sophisticated, synchronized machinery of the Blitzkrieg was stripped of its gears. The sweeping maneuvers halted. The dive bombers circled uselessly above the thick smoke. The German infantry, who were highly trained to sweep into areas already pulverized by heavy guns, suddenly found themselves advancing into intact Soviet kill zones. The macro war of generals, pristine maps, and sweeping arrows had violently crashed to a halt. The German army had been dragged down into a terrifying micro-war. When the traditional front lines dissolved into the apocalyptic rubble, warfare lost its most basic geographic anchor. For centuries, military commanders understood the battlefield as a horizontal plane. You advance across a field, you take a trench, you secure a city block. In Stalingrad, horizontal warfare was completely annihilated. The battlefield had violently mutated into a terrifying, three-dimensional labyrinth. Imagine a heavily armed German squad meticulously clearing the ground floor of a shattered apartment building. They barricade the doors and set up their machine guns, believing they have established a secure perimeter. But in the Rat War, the perimeter simply did not exist. Directly above them, on the third floor, a Soviet platoon was quietly knocking out bricks to create hidden firing slits. In the basement directly below, Soviet sappers were rigging explosives to the foundational pillars, and on the shattered roof, a German sniper team was pinned down by mortar fire. The front line was no longer a line drawn on a map. It was the suffocating, dust-choked space between the floorboards and the ceiling. To survive this three-dimensional meat grinder, the Red Army had to evolve, and they had to do it faster than the German war machine. Historically, the Soviet military doctrine relied on massive, overwhelming waves of infantry and blunt force, but General Chuikov realized that sending a traditional battalion of men into a pulverized factory was an absolute death sentence. The environment demanded a completely new, predatory evolution. The answer was the Stormovaya Grupa, or the Storm Group. Chuikov fundamentally deconstructed his massive army, breaking it down into tiny, highly autonomous kill squads consisting of just 6 to 8 men. These were not traditional infantrymen. They were highly specialized, lightly equipped, and armed exclusively for extreme close-quarters combat. They carried submachine guns, satchel charges, a terrifying number of hand grenades, and sharpened trench spades. More importantly, they were given absolute tactical freedom. They didn't wait for radio orders from a distant command bunker. If a storm group found a weakness in a German defense, a blown-out wall or a collapsed stairwell, they exploited it instantly. They moved like water through the jagged cracks of the German defenses. But the absolute pinnacle of this claustrophobic horror lay completely out of sight. It was the underworld. Stalingrad was a modern industrial hub, and beneath its paved streets lay a massive, complex network of subterranean sewers, drainage pipes, and utility tunnels. The German army possessed incredibly detailed aerial photographs of the city above, but they had absolutely no maps of the dark world below. The Soviet defenders, however, turned this subterranean maze into a primary tactical highway system. This was the psychological breaking point for the German infantry. A German platoon could spend 3 agonizing days taking a single factory floor, suffering horrific casualties, only to finally secure the area. But at night, Soviet scouts would silently navigate the freezing, waist-deep water of the sewers, bypass the German barricades completely, and emerge from a hidden drainage grate directly behind the German lines. For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the terror was absolute and unrelenting. The enemy was no longer just in front of them. They were literally coming out of the walls and rising up from the floors. There was no safe zone. There was no rear echelon. The constant, suffocating fear of an invisible enemy striking from the dark began to fracture the German psyche. Sleep became impossible. Nervous breakdowns swept through the ranks, a psychological collapse the Germans quietly began to call Stalingrad sickness. The highly disciplined, heavily armored conquerors of Europe were being systematically hunted in the dark by men they couldn't even see. When the battlefield fundamentally changes, the tools of survival must change with it. The sprawling, open-field campaigns of the European theater had dictated a specific type of armament, weapons built for range, accuracy, and coordinated strikes. But when the German war machine was dragged into the suffocating, dust-choked basements of Stalingrad, their standard-issue equipment suddenly became a massive liability. The environment forced a violent, accelerated evolution in military tactics, stripping combat down to its most brutal, primal elements. Consider the standard infantry rifle. The German Karabiner 98K was a masterpiece of bolt-action engineering, highly accurate at over 500 yards. But in a ruined Stalingrad stairwell, 500 yards meant absolutely nothing. The weapon was too long, too cumbersome, and far too slow to cycle. The Soviet Mosin Nagant suffered from the exact same problem. If a soldier rounded a dark corner and missed his first shot with a bolt-action rifle, he rarely lived long enough to chamber a second round. Precision was no longer the goal. The new currency of survival was volume of fire. This claustrophobic nightmare demanded a different kind of weapon. Enter the submachine guns. The standard German MP-40 was an excellent, compact, and highly reliable weapon, favored by assault troops, but it carried a 32-round magazine. The Soviet answer to the Rattenkrieg War was an absolute beast, a weapon seemingly born for this exact environment, the PPSH-41. It was heavy, it looked crude, and it was stamped out of converted tractor factories, but it featured a massive 71-round drum magazine and a blistering rate of fire, spitting out 900 rounds a minute. In a terrifying room-clearing scenario, a Soviet soldier armed with a PPSH-41 could unleash a solid, uninterrupted wall of lead, firing twice as long as his German counterpart before needing to reload. In the terrifying arithmetic of the Rattenkrieg, those 3 seconds of reloading were the difference between holding a floor and losing an entire squad. However, the true horror of the Rattenkrieg War was not found in firearms. In the pitch-black, ruined factory cellars, where visibility was reduced to 0 and the quarters were so tight that rifle barrels literally clattered against one another, the fighting devolved into something entirely different. It became medieval. Room clearing became a ruthless, meticulously rehearsed choreography of destruction. An assault would begin with a heavy fragmentation grenade hurled through a doorway, a blown-out wall, or a hole in the ceiling. The concussive blast within a sealed concrete basement was devastating, instantly rupturing eardrums and filling the air with blinding, pulverized brick dust. Immediately following the blast, the Soviet storm group would surge into the room, spraying the shadows with their drum magazine submachine guns. But when the ammunition ran dry, or the fighting became too tangled and chaotic for gunfire, the ultimate weapon of the Rat War was drawn. It was not a bayonet. A bayonet attached to the end of a long rifle was entirely useless in a narrow, debris-filled corridor. The most feared weapon in the Stalingrad underworld was the standard-issue Soviet entrenching tool, the MPL-50 spade. Soviet soldiers systematically sharpened the steel edges of these small, heavy shovels until they were razor-thin. In the dark, confined spaces of a ruined apartment block, this humble digging tool became a devastating, silent, and incredibly lethal implement of close-quarters combat. It could be swung in the tightest of spaces, used to deflect blows, and strike with the terrifying, blunt force weight of an axe. The highly disciplined, cleanly uniformed soldiers of the Wehrmacht were psychologically and tactically prepared for modern mechanized warfare. They expected sweeping maneuvers and tactical flanking. They were completely unprepared for savage hand-to-hand brawls in the pitch-black rubble, fighting for their lives with sharpened shovels and knives. Adding to this apocalyptic nightmare were the flamethrowers, heavily utilized by both sides to clear fortified bunkers and subterranean tunnels. In seconds, a flamethrower could turn an underground stronghold into a suffocating inferno, instantly burning up the very oxygen in the room. This was the terrifying reality of the Rat War. The sophisticated European conquerors had been dragged into a brutal, primal underworld, and they were bleeding out in the dark. To truly understand how the German military machine was dismantled in Stalingrad, you cannot look at a map of the entire city. You have to look at a single building. The macro war of generals and grand strategy had entirely dissolved. The fate of the Eastern Front was now being decided in isolated, fiercely contested microcosms, where the scale of combat was reduced to a few dozen men fighting over a shattered staircase. Two specific locations perfectly illustrate how the defenders of the city weaponized their environment to break the back of the German advance. The first was a towering, surreal monument to industrial combat, the Stalingrad grain elevator. In September 1942, this massive, heavily reinforced concrete complex dominated the southern skyline. As German forces pushed toward the Volga River, the elevator became a vital fortress. The fighting inside was something out of a nightmare. The structure was filled with thousands of tons of grain that had caught fire, filling the cavernous interior with choking, blinding smoke and a horrific stench. Soviet and German soldiers fought pitch-black skirmishes across multiple levels of the same building. You could have a German platoon securing the ground floor, while Soviet defenders rained down fire from the catwalks above. German commanders, desperate to clear the structure, brought up heavy armor and artillery to blast it at point-blank range, but the thick concrete absorbed the punishment. It took the German army over a week of relentless, exhausting combat, suffering heavy casualties just to clear this single building. The effort severely depleted their offensive momentum. But perhaps the most legendary symbol of the Rat War was a seemingly ordinary four-story apartment block in the center of the city, overlooking a vital square. It became known to history as Pavlov's house. Commanded by a 24-year-old sergeant named Yakov Pavlov, a small platoon of Soviet soldiers turned this civilian structure into an impenetrable citadel. They didn't just hold the building, they engineered it into a lethal trap. They heavily mined the approaches and surrounded the perimeter with barbed wire. They knocked out walls to create hidden firing positions for anti-tank rifles on the roof and heavy machine guns in the basement. Most importantly, they dug a deep communication trench out the back, allowing them to be resupplied with ammunition and food without exposing themselves to sniper fire. For nearly 2 months, the German army threw everything they had at Pavlov's house. They sent infantry assaults, dive bombers, and armor. Every single assault was broken. The German tanks couldn't elevate their main guns high enough to hit the roof, and the infantry was shredded by crossfire from the basement. General Vasily Chuikov later noted with grim satisfaction that the Wehrmacht lost more men trying to take this one apartment building than they did taking the entire city of Paris. Why did the sophisticated German military engine completely stall against these isolated strongpoints? It came down to the total collapse of their command structure. The German doctrine relied heavily on top-down coordination, officers directing units in synchronized maneuvers. But in the suffocating isolation of the Rat War, radio signals failed and officers were quickly eliminated by snipers. The Soviet defense, by stark contrast, was entirely decentralized. The environment forced the initiative down to the lowest ranks. The grand strategy was no longer being dictated by a general with a map. It was being executed by a young sergeant in a freezing, dust-filled basement, making split-second decisions to survive. By forcing the Germans to fight building by building, room by room, the defenders stripped the invaders of their coordination, turning a unified, conquering army into a disjointed collection of exhausted men fighting in the dark. While the soldiers of the German Sixth Army were bleeding out in the freezing, pitch-black basements of Stalingrad, a fatal strategic blindness had infected the German high command. Hitler and his generals had become completely obsessed with the micro-war. They poured division after division into the meat grinder, utterly consumed by the daily horrific struggle to capture a single shattered factory floor or a ruined train station. The city bearing Stalin's name had become a psychological anchor. The invincible Blitzkrieg had been reduced to an agonizing, bloody crawl, and in their desperation to win the Rattenkrieg War, the German leadership entirely lost sight of the grand chessboard. This was exactly what the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, had been counting on. While General Chuikov's battered 62nd Army was fighting to the death in the sewers and stairwells, acting as living bait to keep the German war machine pinned down in the rubble, a massive, silent operation was taking shape out in the frozen steppes. Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky had orchestrated a masterclass of strategic deception. They recognized that by concentrating their elite forces inside the city, the Germans had dangerously overextended their flanks, leaving them guarded by poorly equipped and undersupplied Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units. Under the cover of winter darkness and absolute radio silence, the Red Army amassed a staggering force, over 1 million men, nearly 900 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces. On November 19, 1942, the trap finally sprang. It was codenamed Operation Uranus. The Soviet armored spearheads did not attack the heavily fortified ruins of the city. Instead, they punched through the weak Axis flanks north and south of Stalingrad, executing the very type of sweeping mechanized encirclement that the Germans had perfected years earlier. In a matter of days, the two Soviet pincers met at the town of Kalach, deep in the German rear. The great illusion was shattered. The German Sixth Army had won hundreds of terrifying, isolated battles for individual basements and piles of ash, but they had comprehensively lost the macro war. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers were suddenly cut off from the rest of the world. The supreme irony of the Rattenkrieg had been realized. The highly sophisticated conquerors who had marched across Europe were now sealed inside an inescapable frozen cage of their own making. The German hunters, who had spent months systematically clearing the underground labyrinths, had themselves become the rats, trapped in the freezing rubble, waiting for the end. The unstoppable engine of the Third Reich had not just been halted, it had been permanently broken. The legacy of the Rattenkrieg is permanently etched into the foundation of modern military history. Stalingrad proved with devastating clarity that the most advanced military technology and the most brilliant strategic minds can be completely broken by the sheer, unyielding will of men fighting for the ashes of their own homes. The unstoppable Blitzkrieg was not defeated in a grand, sweeping field maneuver. It was bled dry in the basements, the sewers, and the suffocating stairwells of a single, ruined city. It was the place where the invincible European conqueror was dragged down into the dark and where the hunter ultimately became the hunted. Which aspect of this claustrophobic underground war do you find the most fascinating? Was it the brutal evolution of close-quarters combat and the use of infantry spades, or the grueling room-by-room stand in places like Pavlov's house? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you appreciate deep dives into the tactics, the grit, and the unfiltered truth of military history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have plenty more historical documentaries coming your way. Until next time, remember that history is often written not by the generals on the map, but by the soldiers holding the line in the dark.